Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. The last video was deeply rooted in emotions and the feels, but today we're going to switch things up and go super analytical. Months back, I got a comment on one of my videos that sent my ADHD into hyperfixation mode, leading me to buy too much paint in the name of science. The commenter said that it was sleazy for a brand to use a non-standard pan size, perceiving it to be a slight from the brand being referenced. Tube sizes vary by brand and prices vary in different countries. Just like tube size, not every brand uses a standard pan or half pan size. However, we as consumers can calculate the price per milliliter when given the price and the size of the vessel. For the record, I am not trying to simply defend Da Vinci for the sake of defending a brand that I work with often. I'm hoping that you all know from my other content that I am not a brand loyalist. But I also don't want you to have to just take my word for it, so I decided to make this video. Disclaimer, I am not a scientist or a statistician, and this experiment is not perfect, so please be gentle with me. However, to the best of my means and ability, I wanted to find the answer to how much are we actually paying for our watercolors? My apologies to our international viewers and anyone logical who would weigh a small amount of something in grams. I have no idea why past Denise recorded the initial weights in ounces. There's no excuse other than my fibrofog for not questioning why I was using so many decimal places. Anyway, the process went like this. I decided which colors to use based on a number of factors, such as which pigments I already had a lot of on hand to reduce the amount that I would have to spend, which would be most affordable to purchase if I needed to buy them, are the colors transparent or opaque, granulating or non-granulating, etc. I decided on transparent PR101 and PB29. There are a couple of exceptions here that we will cover when we get to them. On March 20th, I individually labeled and weighed every half pan that I was going to be using and recorded their weights to 3 decimal points. All of them were between 0.027 and 0.028 ounces. Next, I freshly poured each color into its respective half pan. I carefully used a stirring tool to push the paint into the corners when needed, tapped them down to make sure that they were completely full, and to the best of my human ability, I leveled them off to be as flush with the upper walls as possible. Then I recorded those weights. I stored them on a shelf in my closet to try and avoid cat hair and dust as much as possible. Then a few weeks later, on April 14th, I did another weigh-in. But to make extra super sure that they were as dry as possible, I waited another couple of weeks, weighed them up for a final time on May 8th. Yes, they did survive the flood and my emergency move, thank goodness. From all of these numbers, I could calculate the weight of the paint without the weight of the half pan for both the fresh and the dried paint. Then I could calculate the overall percentage of weight lost, which is presumably water that has evaporated. Now, what this data cannot tell us is how much binder versus pigment is in each formula. It doesn't account for the fact that volume is not the same thing as weight. It also doesn't account for using a proper drying technique, like filling a half pan halfway, then waiting for it to dry, and then filling it again so that the paint dries more evenly. But I wanted to get this video to you sometime this year, so I was only concerned with how much the paint shrank so that we could compare the amount of paint as far as pricing goes. Let's look at the visual results first. Daniel Smith's transparent red oxide pulled away from the walls and hollowed in the middle despite me trying to release all of the air bubbles before they began drying. I didn't have enough of Daniel Smith's French Ultramarine to fill the pan, and I don't like this color enough to repurchase it for, ongoing use, so I filled what I could. It's hard to note visual differences for that reason, but we'll rely on the weights later. The PR101 did collect some cat hair and dust more readily than some of the other paint samples did. There is slight dipping in both of the Da Vinci colors. Burnt Sienna Deep did not pull away from the walls at all, and the ultramarine blue pulled away from one corner and has a bit of binder separation. Neither of them collected dust or hair that couldn't easily be brushed off. Graham's results were really intriguing. The transparent red iron oxide noticeably shrank, but did so while smoothly moving down the walls of the half pan, which none of the other brands did. The ultramarine blue barely changed at all, aside from a very slight dip, and as a watercolor that contains honey, it did attract a fair amount of hair, despite me trying to protect them. You may have already noticed that I didn't have Quartz Ultramarine, and it wasn't a color that I wanted to spend the higher price tag on, so instead we have French Cerulean Blue as a stand-in. I am not heavily weighing it in line with the other ultramarines, but I did want another data point of reference for the study. It pulled away from the walls, shrank down, and is less pretty than some of the other colors, but it's still fully functional. The transparent brown oxide visibly shrank the most out of all of the colors that I tested. Winsor & Newton's Burnt Sienna is their transparent PR101. It shows a not insignificant dip, but it didn't pull away from the walls. Like Daniel Smith, I didn't have enough of the ultramarine green shade to fill the entire pan. I filled what I could, and we will rely on the weight. Schmincke has a reputation for creating absolutely beautiful pans with their rich, creamy formulas, but these two colors are not among the prettiest. There was a lot of shrinkage for both transparent sienna and French ultramarine. The sienna pulled away from two of the walls, leaving a large gap, and the ultramarine left a big old dip. Finally, I wanted to test Sennelier, but they don't have a transparent PR101, so I ordered what I thought was a transparent PR101 from Holbein, light red. Turns out this color is opaque, and it's not a fair comparison anyway, so the purchase was entirely unnecessary. However, there is extremely little change in the Holbein pan aside from some slight pulling away from one corner. Sennelier's Ultramarine Deep pulled away from two walls and noticeably shrank. This formula also contains honey, so it is a fur magnet. Alrighty, I have some nerdy little charts here. Please be kind. As I mentioned before, statistics is not my strong suit. These charts show the weights of the paint alone without the weight of the pan included. PR101 is on the left and PB29 is on the right. The first and lightest color bar for each brand is the weight of the freshly poured paint. The middle bar was weighed approximately 3 weeks later, and the last darkest bar is the final weight recorded 7 weeks after the initial pour. The main thing that I wanted to see here was kind of the difference between the initial pour and the weight relative to each other within each brand. To make that easier to see, the next graphs show the percentage of weight lost. The brand with the biggest difference for the transparent PR101 was Graham, followed by Core and Daniel Smith. The brand that lost the least was Da Vinci, followed by Schmincke and Winsor & Newton. For PB29, Daniel Smith had the biggest difference, followed by Schmincke and Winsor & Newton. Graham lost the least, followed by Da Vinci. The last graphs are far from perfect science, but given the varied amount of weight lost, presumably water weight, I wanted to approximate the adjusted price per tube based on how much each paint dried down. I am in the US, so these prices are using Blick prices, with the Schmincke and Sennelier coming from Jackson's. The darker pink is the price per milliliter based on just the fresh paint in the tube, while the light pink is adjusted for the percentage of each brand that was lost during drying. By far, the clear winner for both the transparent PR101 and the PB29 is Da Vinci, coming in at nearly half the price of most of the other brands. I will note that Da Vinci does tend to have more binder in their formula than most other professional brands, meaning some of the colors can dry glossy in the mass tone if you use a lot of it very concentrated. However, I find the pigment payout to be extremely satisfying regardless, and I'm happy to keep an eye on the mass tones for half the price of other professional watercolors, but I just did want to mention that we don't know how much of each formula is pigment versus binder. This experiment has taught me a lot about my own perceptions and preconceived notions as well, My assumption going in was that Core was the most expensive American brand and Winsor & Newton was the most expensive European brand out of the brands that I tested. The latter is true here in the US, but it turns out that Core is actually pretty evenly priced with Daniel Smith. And sometime over the last several years, Graham pricing has definitely creeped up and it's not as affordable as it once was. I'm sorry that I can't provide pricing details for every other country, but I do hope that there are some useful nuggets in here for our international viewers when it comes to figuring out the price of our watercolor paints. Finally, we'll wrap up by swatching the colors that I used in this test, all of them being re-wet for the pans that have been drying for 7 weeks. I did not pre-spray them with water and I attempted to get the same gradient in every wash. They pretty much all performed how I expected them to, meaning Daniel Smith had a moderate pigment payout that was easy to paint with. Da Vinci had a high pigment payout that created really bold washes. Graham had a moderate to high pigment payout with no particular notes. Core had a high pigment payout that flowed eagerly in water. Some people say that Core is harder to re-wet than other brands, but I don't find that to be true in these colors or in my general painting with them. Winsor & Newton's Burnt Sienna was difficult to re-wet, causing bubbles, and it had a very low pigment payout. The ultramarine green shade re-wet beautifully though and created a really lovely wash. Schmincke has a moderate but soft pigment payout. Sennelier's Ultramarine Deep had a high pigment payout and is a gorgeously smooth gradient. This is the ultramarine that I keep on my Porcelain Studio palette. And Holbein's Light Red had a high pigment payout that created a really bold wash. As always, I prefer and encourage others to mix and match brands on their studio palettes, choosing the best pigments that each brand has to offer for their personal preferences. Every brand has strengths and weaknesses, which can vary based on the subjects that you paint and what brands are available to you in your area. Thank you all for coming along with me in this nerdy arse video. I hope that it was helpful. A special thanks to my lovely patrons who help support me in videos like this. And if you're new to the channel and somehow made it this far, thank you and welcome. You might enjoy some of my more exciting videos, like watching paint dry. That was a joke. I do have a lot of swatching videos, but I also paint things and do reviews as well. Okay, until next time, happy painting!